Illinois House and lawmakers there may create a state abortion access fund. 25 News reporter Angeles Pompa breaks down how it could work and both sides of the debate.
Currently, under federal law, some insurance plans that cover abortion beyond cases of rape, incest, or when the life of the mother is threatened collect a $1 per month from all of their customers. Those funds help cover care for underinsured or uninsured patients.
We know that Illinois is the backbone of sexual and reproductive health care in the Midwest and the country. So this bill will further cement, in Illinois for patients across the state.
The bill, sponsored by Democratic State Representative Anna Moeller of Elgin, would give the state more oversight of these funds, which are currently held by insurance companies. It would require insurers to report how much money is collected, how much is spent, and transfer any remaining funds into a new state-run abortion access fund.
20% of Planned Parenthood of Illinois' abortion care visits in the last year were in Central Illinois. And that includes Planned Parenthood of Illinois' health centers in Champaign, Peoria, and Springfield. And so this legislation could support those local residents who are in need of accessing care in Central Illinois.
Opponents, including the Illinois Family Institute, say they are concerned the measure encourages abortions in the state.
Illinois has been committing about 90,000. We're going close to 100,000 abortions a year, especially those numbers have gone up dramatically since Roe v. Wade was struck down by the Supreme Court. And of those numbers, 35,000 are coming from across the border.
Smith also raises concerns about how the fund would be used, arguing it could direct more public money toward abortion services rather than other needs.
Maybe even refunding that money to the proper sources in order to be able to bring down prices and the costs and the burdens on hardworking families in Illinois.
If approved by the state Senate and signed into law, the fund would distribute money through grants to various organizations and providers offering abortion care. For more information on the legislation, visit our website at 25news.com. In Peoria, Angeles Pompa, 25 News.